made of stories. Wow, I thought when I read that. I know that when I was a kid, when I heard stories, they helped nourish my dreams and build me up. And I wanted to be like so-and-so. And I wanted to help people. You know, I wanted to be Red Riding Hood. And, well, I realize that we learn about ourselves from the stories of others. Now, you might not look like the person that's telling the story. You might be a different age and a different race and a different religion, a different sex. I mean, it's somebody, even a child can tell you a story, and it might waken something up inside of you. We never know, but stories make a difference. I believe it. I've experienced it. And if you'll allow me to tell you some stories today, maybe you can take something from some of them, or one of them, home with you, and maybe it can inspire you, or nurture you, or comfort you, whatever. So, that's how I started when I talked to Rick Moody and Dick Ambrosius and about 4 other people in the world 30 years ago who believed that we had a terrible image of aging in this country. And so the 15 or 20 of us got together and talked to each other and worried about why nobody else would listen to us. People were working at advertising agencies and poo-pooing the idea you just had to cater to the young, and it was the same all over. And so what we did is we talked about how we had to get rid of that. Well, somebody said to me, you know how we look at aging in America? The 5 Ds. I said, what's that? They said decline, deterioration, decay, dependence, and then death. You know, we're not so far from that now. Yes, a lot of people have changed their attitudes. And I'll tell you, 30 years ago, there wouldn't be a positive aging conference, I can assure you. But there still is, out in our culture, that feeling, advertising, marketing, fashions, whatever, that the way that you grow old in this culture is to stay young. Well, if that's what is the food that we're getting out there, then we sure don't look at aging as bringing other things into our lives that aren't positive, like staying young. Now, when I discovered in my own situation and looked around and talked to many others, we were middle-aged children, I was at one time, with aging parents. And what happens when you live 2,500 miles from your parent? Well, I thought, gee, I've been doing radio programs now about aging, and I've been doing interviewing all kinds of people and relating stories about things that people are doing to deal with the disabilities that come with aging, the illness you deal with, how you keep your attitude up. But what about when you have to care for somebody else? It gets in the way. It changes your life. But you know, who is going to care for my mother? Of course I'd care for my mother. Of course, if you have a disabled child or a child that needs your help and the child's 40 years old, you're a caregiver forever. And some people take it on as a profession. Hospice is born in the United States and we take on death and dying with others willingly and warmly, and it makes a difference in the caregiver's life. Well, I started collecting stories, and I did a public radio program on family caregivers. And you know, at that time I had left the network and I was producing as an independent because my 34-year-old boss said, aging, we'll run your programs, everybody likes your programs, but go out and get your own funding. We're not going to make a job for you here on aging. I'm happy to say that the attitude of public radio has changed today, but I took the challenge. You know, at age 48, 50, when you're going to birthday parties where they tell you to wear all black and tell bad jokes, you know, about being old. And I looked around and I saw something different. I mean, I saw that the reflection of that image wasn't the only one out there. There were people that were dealing in a positive way with whatever life brought to them. Now, I just want to skip ahead and tell you that that's what brought me to caregiving. You see, I looked at aging as what we can learn about ourselves when we get older. I mean, at one time I thought if you figure it out at 50, you got it solved. Nobody told me that you go through a transition with everything that might happen in your life, all the changes, the challenges, the ones to your body, the ones to your family, the ones to your friends. You have to be open to changes and challenges every day of your life, or else you're stuck, unable to handle what comes along. So, I looked at caregiving because I had become immersed in it. And I thought to myself, all you ever hear is, it's upset my life. I had to leave my job. What am I going to do? My mother lives in New York. I live in California. And everybody was trying to figure out, well, I thought, I'll do a radio program on this. And there I was independently producing it. Well, I worked with one other person that helped me, and then you give the radio program to the network, and you just wonder. Nobody ever listens to it before it goes out. And then all of a sudden, I start getting phone calls and requests from public radio stations saying, listen, I told my neighbor about that program. Can we get permission to run it again? And then people start calling me and saying, I want to tell you about my dad. I want to tell you about my husband. I said, well, I'm not a counselor. Just listen to me, they said. And I spent a lot of time on the phone listening to caregiver stories. And then I thought, well, maybe I can write a book. And so that's where the Gifts of Caregiving, Stories of Hardship, Hope, and Healing was born. And I'm going to share, as I threatened to do, some of the stories and hope that maybe we can all learn something if we're open. Well, one woman I met left her job on Friday and drove, I don't know how many miles, to go take care of her two parents that stayed in a retirement home. The mother had memory problems, and the father was physically totally disabled. So she would pick the mother up and take the mother to their home, and she would clean the house and make meals, and they would tend the garden together. And the mother never even, of course, realized that she hadn't been there all week and that her daughter hadn't been there. And she came every weekend. I came to help my mother and my father as well. Although It's hard for him to come with us to the house, so I don't do that very often. I usually leave him at the home. And then he knows that the bills will be paid and the property will be taken care of and nothing will be neglected. I've driven through snowstorms, rainstorms, and all kinds of weather to get there, but I've never let them down. I know that the schedule has taken taking on the care for my parents can put a terrible strain on marriages. But my husband and I have worked it out, and we've become closer, and we understand one another better. And now my husband is extremely supportive. After all, this is a temporary situation, however long it lasts. Here's just another little excerpt from this woman. She said, "You know, I learned a lot about caregiving, and I've also learned a lot about myself. A few days after being with my parents, I'm ready to get back to my own life, but I know next weekend I'll be back, and I'll be important in their lives. Caregiving is probably one of the most rewarding things I've ever done, and it's also the most difficult. I know that my mother probably doesn't remember the details of my visits, but I have that warm and wonderful experience of seeing her light up for that moment when I arrive on the weekends. I think that she smiles and laughs, and we share a lot healthier times than she would have alone. Sometimes she responds to me in such a way that you'd never know she's senile. I say to her, 'You know, you're my favorite mom.' And she'll reply, 'That's because I'm your only mom.' She smiles every time we have that exchange, and we do it over and over. Yet it's the best feeling for me, and it makes my day." So let's see, what other story might I share with you? My publisher said, "Well, you go and you talk to these people, but nobody knows who they are. Why don't you get a couple of celebrities? You used to interview all those celebrities at National Public Radio. Why don't you go see some of them and talk to them about caregiving?" So, although both of these people have passed on now, Dana and Christopher Reeve, I did go to their home. It was a day when Christopher couldn't come down and talk. It was a bad day. But I did talk to Dana Reeve, and she taught me something about caregiving. I was able to cope with this unexpected situation better than I ever could have believed. Family rushed in, friends rushed in, neighbors were incredible. There was an energy that came up for me, and it was all about problem solving. Day by day, it was almost like I had to get these things done, and I had to take care of insurance, filling out forms, talking with the doctors, and I told myself, as many women in this situation do, I can do it, I can do it, I can do it. Whatever it is, I can do it. I can cope with it, and I can do it all. A trap for caregivers. It takes a tremendous amount of energy, almost manic energy. And then, about 18 months into things, there was a sinking realization and a slowing down where you realize, okay, this isn't a sprint, it's a long distance run. Then, along with that realization, comes a down period for me, and I know for other caregivers as well. This is now the status quo. We've begun to realize that this is normal life now. One of the things I've realized is that I'm part of a group of caregivers, and I need to let them know that they need to ask for help when they need it. I realize that I'm in a position that many other people aren't because I have money and I have a position of privilege. But I have also found that when I'm faced with other things, that taking care of someone's emotions is harder than the physical care. I know that in many ways, dealing with a loved one's depression and negative emotions is more difficult than the physical care. I can lift all day long. I can wipe a face or wipe a bottom. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. You do it, you've achieved it, and it's done. But dealing with someone's emotions is much more complicated, much more ongoing, and I've grown a lot in coming to understand that. I'm not sure how I really can describe it all, but the reality of the hardship of life is much more present now. Life is about compromise and coping with difficulties. I'm going to remember that. I think it's a chance to learn something that I've been given. We often think of only women as being caregivers. Of course I would take care of my parents. Well, I interviewed them, and I learned a lot from them. I'm going to tell you the story that this gentleman shared with me. He taught at an upstate university in New York. And he had private clients, and he taught students, and he taught classes, and he coached students. And then his parents, who lived in the same town, he lost his mother, who his father had taken care of, and then his father became very ill. And his father said, as many parents say to their kids, "I'm not moving out of this house." So he worked it out according to what his father wanted at that time. I wanted my father's care to be perfect. I really thought I could make him well, and I was going to do everything right and keep him alive another 10 or more years. I was so busy making things right that I didn't acknowledge the reality. The truth was that he knew he was going to die soon. So for the few months, I was involved in the doing. I had to constantly be doing something for my dad. I would get done working at the college, see my private clients, get to my dad's house at 7 o'clock at night, make his dinner, change his bed, do the laundry, give him his medicine, clean the house, get his meals ready for the next day, change his clothes, and leave a little after 9 and go home to my family. And I do that every single night. And all the time I was running around the house, he said, doing those things, my father would say, "Hey, come on, talk to me. Sit down and talk to me. Don't do that. Sit down and talk to me. I want to tell you something." "No, Dad, I'm too busy. I can't do that now." And then all of a sudden, in the middle of everything, the father would say, "Hey, come on in here. I want to hear what your day was like." He said, "Dad, I can't do that now. I've got to get this done, and I want to get your lunch ready for tomorrow." And well, I was so busy doing. I learned that I had no time for being. I suddenly became aware that sitting down and getting together with my dad might be an opportunity that could never come again. Anyone could do the household stuff, I realized, but no one could be with my dad like I could. And there was no person in this world who could be with me like my dad could. So things changed, and I'd come over to the house just to be with him. And I'd take him out to lunch, and we'd spend hours talking together. And I got somebody to come in the house, and everything was taken care of. And you know what? These were our best times together. My dad was thinking deeply about the meaning of his life, his values, and how he had conducted his business and raised his children and taught them what they needed to know. We talked about my mother, his mother, whom he said he hadn't seen since he was a child, but he was dreaming about his mom a lot, maybe because he knew he was dying and would soon be seeing her. And that's when I started to cry, and he teared up too. Can you believe that two Italian men who aren't supposed to cry were both deeply touched? We had entered a new level of our relationship, a kind of intimacy that we'd never had before. And after he died, he said, being busy, filling every moment with doing, neglected part of what I needed to do to keep living and learning. We never know what tomorrow is going to bring. I had heard those words for many years, people talking about living in the moment. But I didn't understand. I hadn't lived it. Changing the priorities in my life gave me a chance to learn that my dad was really special. I came to understand that he was a deep thinker and a philosopher. Getting to know my father and to know him so intimately helped me understand more about myself. And looking back, the illness that I had damned for so long, in truth, offered me a new way to be with my dad. Without his dependence on me and my participation in his care, I might never have experienced or understood what I had come to learn, and I hope I never forget it. Caregivers don't know what they're going to learn, what they're going to be faced with, what they're going to take on. I talked with one woman and her husband who were taking care of a child who was born with several disabilities. Well, the whole story is about, of course, how she cried every time she went walking and saw someone with a child that age. She cried, knowing that she would have, for as long as the child stays alive, a completely dependent child who was blind, crippled, couldn't eat, couldn't digest food right, lived totally on liquids. I hope I can find what they said here. I'll tell you the end of her story here. She talks about how I wanted to have fun and have a normal life. So we decided we'd have parties and invite friends over. I wanted to be cheerful and happy, and I had every reason to be depressed and angry. But I've been there. She talked about the early years of the child's life and how she really didn't feel much like the mom. But that old feeling of rejecting what had happened and feeling like it was my fault, it all fell away, and I choose never to go there again. I'm not vulnerable anymore like that. I'm less anxious than I used to be, and I've gotten over the feeling that I did something wrong, and that's why I had a kid that wasn't healthy. But I didn't. I took good care of myself. It just happened, and that's my fault, not my fault. And now I live with the truth of that situation. I'll tell you how things are now. When Kate was about 5, my mother-in-law broke her hip and was confined to a wheelchair. She needed constant care and wasn't getting it at home, so we said we'd take her into our home. She lived with us for about a year and a half with a 12-hour day professional care necessary for her. Halfway through, she had trouble swallowing, and she finally got her a stomach tube and was fed the same way we feed Kate, her daughter. I remember one evening sitting at the table having dinner with my husband. It was a normal dinner hour, just like anybody else might have, except that Kate was buzzing around the living room, bumping into things, and my mother-in-law was in the back room with the TV blaring, and all the while she was mumbling and talking back to the television set. And that was our nutty household, and that's what it is. You live with what you've got. Oh, you know, I will tell you a wonderful story. Rick Moody mentioned that he and his wife were caregivers. When this was quite many years ago, they took in a friend who had been like a grandfather to their children, a man who lived alone after he took care of his wife. His wife passed away, and they would have him over for dinner once a week, and the kids would call him Grandpa, like another grandpa. Well, let's see if I can find what I want to read here. No. Rick, what page is it on?
I have memory impairment. Story.
Well, I'd rather read you her words. Page 66. Don't forget that, Rick. As I recall, although I'm not going to read the whole story, so I don't know exactly, but I believe you built a room onto your house.
Right.
And for a while, Mr. Morris was ambulatory, and it was a while before he needed a lot of care. Now here's taking care of somebody who isn't a blood relationship, but they had adopted as a grandpa. My time with Mr. Morris taught me a great deal. We talk about how important it is to live in the moment, and sometimes we say blithely, not really understanding what it means. But when you're forced by your circumstances to slow down your life to the pace of someone who really does have to live in the moment, it changes your life. I would wake Mr. Morris up about 9:30 in the morning, and it would take me until 11:30 to get him his breakfast, dress him, comb his hair, help him with his teeth, and situate him in a wheelchair. And that made him comfortable for the day. And that would take me about 2 hours. But in those 2 hours, we would each live in the moment. I found it a humbling experience to know that I really had that to learn. I knew this thing we were going through together could be a horrible thing, a drudgery, or together we could make it a deeply meaningful experience. Remembering that made it easy for me, and to make it an experience, something special and kind. In such caring exchanges that we had, we made our day mean more than just morning chores. The reality was that Mr. Morris and I were partners, We were partners in this caregiving together, and we learned from each other. I discovered that there were many ways you can approach each moment. We all do so much in our lives that ultimately hasn't much meaning. I think it can focus on, if you focus on the present and truly know the value of doing something for someone that's something good and that the person really needs that right now, that you can do that good thing, then everybody wins. I just know that service to others expands one's life and adds beauty. And as I look back now, those years were the best years of my life. The best years of my life? It was a blessing for us to take care of Mr. Morris. It was an absolute gift. We know there aren't many opportunities that people have in their life to get back, and this was ours. Mr. Morris would not have had the comfort and dignity he deserved if he hadn't come to stay with us, but we were the winners in this situation. It's easy to help when the need is clear. The way I live my life today, I see service as a gift. I had the opportunity to step in and help, and that was the gift to me. That's why I call it the gifts of caregiving. I think I'll save some of this for later, for when I bump into you or when you ask questions, but I want to tell you about the end of the book. I was over the deadline when the publisher expected the book. Because I couldn't decide what story to put at the end. You want to have something at the end of the book that you don't want the people reading it to forget. You want a punch at the end. And so my publisher said, I guess you need a celebrity at the end. So by this time, I didn't have any connections with celebrities anymore. I had been long gone from being the arts reporter at National Public Radio. But I remember that I read in the paper that Studs Terkel's wife had passed away. And I thought, oh, good, he was a caregiver. And I know Studs Terkel. I don't know him well, but I had interviewed him twice during my career and during his. And so I lived, I don't know where I was living at the time, but what does it matter? He was still in Chicago. And I jumped on a plane. And I went to Chicago, expecting to ask him similar questions. His wife had passed away. I was going to ask him to tell me his story as a caregiver. Well, I don't know if any of you had ever met Studs, who has passed on now. But Studs never talked about himself. You ask him a question, he'd tell you a story. He remembered every conversation he ever had with anybody. But he didn't talk about himself. So I walked in and we sat down and I started asking questions. And he said, my wife is in this jar over here. She was cremated. So I thought, well, here we go. And every question I asked him about her, he said to me, I don't talk about myself. I don't talk about my life. But I'll tell you a story, he said. And he starts telling me different interviews that he's done. And I keep thinking, how can I get back to this? I got to succeed. My publisher said, I got to have this stuff in. Talk about short vision. Well, anyway, so what happened was, he tells me a story. Here's the last story he told me. About a man who was affected by one particular, no, wait. It's a story about a man told him about the illness and death of a loved one. He had lost his companion, and he told me that reading stories about other people dealing with sickness, suffering, and loss was a healing experience for him. And now he may go out and tell others his story and have an effect on someone else. And let's see, what story did he tell me? Oh, he talked about a film that he had seen based on the movie Lord Jim. He was talking about the film based on Joseph Conrad's novel, and he said, well, that movie is about me. It's a guy who was a coward all his life and suddenly found courage, and that's me. I sensed that the story was too good to be true, so I turned up my tape recorder, and I always have it with me. So there you are. You never know when you're going to get a story to pass on to others. So I thought, well, I can't end the book with a second-hand story that Studs Terkel told me. So I went back to home, and the first thing I did was the ironing. Because when I'm stuck, and I hadn't done the ironing for about 8 months. When I'm stuck somewhere in my work, I all of a sudden have to do the ironing and clean drawers. I know that you have some understanding of this. Well, I was cleaning the drawer. This is a true story, and this is how I've ended the book. And I come across, here. Well, I come across a quote that I had written down at a lecture that I had heard. And the quote, I had written it on a paper napkin, just like the ones you have there, the brown napkins, because I had my coffee there, and I was at this lecture. And this person read a quote from a children's book called Crow and Weasel by Barry Lopez. And it was such a great quote, I wrote it down. The quote is, if stories come to you, care for them and learn to give them away where they are needed. Sometimes a person needs a story more than food to stay alive. There was the end of the book. The last page has fallen out of my copy, not the new ones. And it's so true, you see. And so, whatever your story is, or whatever it will be, and we don't know, I also did an interview with Rosalind Carter, and you're probably familiar with her quote, but it doesn't hurt to repeat it many times. It's what really decided me that I had to pursue caregivers. She said, there are only 4 kinds of people in this world. There are caregivers. There are people that are caregivers now, people who have been caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will be cared for. That pretty much covers all of us. So I leave you with that message at a positive aging conference because I think what we're here for is to find ways to keep growing and embracing whatever situation comes into our lives and hopefully people's stories will give you some help in doing that. Your turn.
Thank you. Thank you. Isak Dinesen once said, "All the sorrows of life are bearable if only we can convert them into a story." And what Connie has done is to help us